The rain had been falling for 6 hours, a relentless silver-gray curtain drawn across the city. It was 2:13 a.m. at St. Jude's Community Hospital, an hour when the world outside held its breath and the world inside never slept. For Eli Vance, this was the hour of purification. The rhythmic slosh of the mop in the bucket, the squeak of the rubber blade against linoleum, the sharp, clean scent of bleach, these were the elements of his late-night liturgy. He was on his 3rd pass of the emergency department's floors, a Sisyphean task that brought him a strange, quiet comfort. The fluorescent lights of ER Bay 4 hummed a flat, indifferent note overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the sway of his mop. Eli, known to the night staff as just Eli, was a man designed for invisibility. At 48, his hair was threaded with a distinguished gray at the temples that hinted at a life lived with more intensity than his current occupation suggested. He wore the standard-issue gray janitorial uniform, the fabric softened from 1,000 washes, the name Eli embroidered in neat blue script over his heart. His posture was usually a study in self-effacement, a slight slump to his shoulders that made him seem smaller, less obtrusive. But it was his hands that told a different story. When he gripped the mop handle, they were just a working man's hands. But in moments of stillness, when he thought no one was watching, he would flex his fingers, an unconscious, intricate motion. They were long, elegant, and preternaturally steady, a surgeon's hands. A faint, silvery scar bisected his right eyebrow, a relic from a life he no longer claimed, a life before St. Jude's, before the mop, before the quiet desperation that had become his shield. He paused his work, leaning the mop against the wall. From his vantage point in the empty bay, he could see the main nurses' station and the bank of telemetry monitors above it. Most of the readouts were green, placid lines charting the mundane rhythms of sleep and recovery. But one, belonging to a Mr. Henderson in Bay 6, a post-op appendectomy, showed a subtle flicker, a premature ventricular contraction, a blip. A passing night nurse, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone, walked by without a glance upward. Eli watched the screen. Another PVC, then a third, a couplet. His body tensed, the janitor's slump vanishing, replaced by an alert stillness. His eyes, which often seemed lost in a distant haze, were now sharp, analytical. He mentally ran through Henderson's chart, which he'd glimpsed earlier. Middle-aged, slightly overweight, smoker. Probably low potassium from the pre-op fasting. The nurse would catch it on the next vitals check. Still, he watched for a full minute, his breathing shallow, until the rhythm on the screen settled back into its steady, reassuring sine wave. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The instinct, the diagnostic cascade that had once defined his entire existence, was a phantom limb that still ached with purpose. He forced his shoulders to slump again, reaching for the familiar weight of the mop. Hiding wasn't a passive state. It was an active, exhausting practice of self-suppression. He had his reasons. They were sleeping soundly 20 miles away, in a small rented house on a quiet tree-lined street. His phone, tucked into his back pocket, vibrated softly against his hip. He pulled it out, the screen's glow stark in the dim corridor. A text from Mrs. Gable, the kind-hearted, white-haired widow from next door, who was his lifeline. Lily had the dream again, but she's okay now. Asked for you. Fell back asleep, holding her telescope eyepiece. The message landed like a stone in his chest. The dream. The one where she was in a vast, dark room, calling for him, and he couldn't answer. A simple, childish nightmare that was a brutally accurate metaphor for his own life. He typed back a reply, his thumb sure and steady on the small screen. "Thank you, Eleanor. I'll be home before the sun's up. I promise." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "I promise." It was the most sacred vow he had. For the past 4 years, his entire world had been built around keeping that single, simple promise. It was why he was here, in the dead of night, surrounded by the ghosts of the man he used to be, armed with a mop and a bucket of bleach-scented water. He was just Eli, the janitor. He was invisible. And that was the only way he knew how to keep his daughter safe. He'd just finished Bay 4 and was wheeling his cart toward the main corridor when the night's fragile peace shattered. The double doors of the ambulance bay flew open with a pneumatic hiss, admitting a blast of rain-soaked air and a controlled chaos of bodies. 2 paramedics, their faces grim and beaded with rain, wheeled a gurney at a near run. On it lay a young woman, her body convulsing in a violent, terrifying seizure. 22-year-old female, status epilepticus, unresponsive in the field, the lead paramedic shouted, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the ER. Vitals are all over the place. BP 190/110, tachy at 140. The night shift snapped into action. Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief of emergency medicine, materialized from the doctor's lounge, his face a mask of professional calm. He was a man in his mid-50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a demeanor that radiated an almost severe competence. He was followed by his team, including Dr. Jennings, a young resident whose ambition was as sharp and noticeable as the crease in his trousers. "Trauma 1, now!" Thorne commanded, his voice the undisputed center of gravity in the swirling room. Eli instinctively pulled his cart back, melting into an alcove near the vending machines. From here, he had a clear, unobstructed view. It was a practiced position, one he'd taken 100 times before. The observer, the ghost. The team descended on the gurney, a flurry of white coats and blue scrubs. They transferred the young woman to the bed in Trauma 1. The curtain pulled not quite shut. Eli could still see, could still hear. "Push 4 of Ativan," Thorne ordered. "Get a full metabolic panel, tox screen, CBC, and get her on the EEG, stat. Let's rule out the obvious." The obvious. Eli had built a career on the ruins of the obvious. He watched as they worked. The young woman's name was Maya, he heard a nurse say, reading from the paramedics' report. She was a grad student at the local university. Her fiancé was on his way, frantic. They were trying to get a line in, but the seizure made it difficult. Eli's focus narrowed. He wasn't just watching the scene, he was absorbing it. The nystagmus, the rapid, involuntary jerking of her eyes, the specific quality of her seizure, less grand mal, and more a chaotic, disoriented thrashing. The clammy pallor of her skin, the standard panels came back, one by one. Tox screen, negative. Blood alcohol, 0. No signs of meningitis. The Ativan wasn't breaking the seizure. They gave her another dose. Still, she thrashed. "This makes no sense," Jennings muttered, loud enough for Thorne to hear. "She has no history of epilepsy. No head trauma. Maybe it's a rare encephalitis." "Let's get ready to intubate and start a propofol drip," Thorne said, his voice tight. "We need to protect her airway and stop this seizure before she has permanent brain damage." They were chasing symptoms, throwing darts in the dark. Eli felt a familiar, cold dread creeping up his spine. He knew this feeling. He had lived inside this feeling for 11 agonizing months. The smell of the ER, that unique cocktail of antiseptic, latex, and the faint, metallic tang of fear, was a powerful, unwelcome key. It unlocked a door in his memory he tried to keep permanently bolted. Suddenly, he wasn't in St. Jude's anymore. He was at Johns Hopkins 8 years ago. But he wasn't the janitor. He was Dr. Elias Vance, chief of trauma surgery, standing beside his wife, Anna, in a similar ER bay. She had been suffering from what her GP called a stubborn stomach bug. She was a cellist, a woman whose entire being seemed to hum with a vibrant, life-affirming energy. But now she was pale, nauseated, and had lost 15 pounds she couldn't afford to lose. He remembered the resident, a young man just like Jennings, confidently diagnosing her with gastritis. "We'll give her some fluids, something for the nausea, and she should be right as rain," he'd said with a dismissive smile. Eli, even then, had felt a prickle of unease. He had pushed. He had used his title, his reputation. "Run a full abdominal CT with contrast," he had told the attending physician, a man he knew well. "Let's be thorough." The attending had placated him, patting him on the shoulder. "Elias, relax. You're too close to it. It's a bug. Let's not expose her to unnecessary radiation." They had listened to the attending. They had sent Anna home. They had been confidently, catastrophically wrong. The memory was so vivid it made his stomach clench. He could feel the cold vinyl of the visitor's chair, hear the squeak of the IV pole as they discharged her. He remembered the look of relief on Anna's face, a relief he couldn't share. Back in the present, the curtain to Trauma 1 swished aside. Nurse Helen, a veteran with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, was heading to the supply closet. She was the one person on the night shift who looked at Eli for a fraction too long, whose "good evening" held a note of questioning respect that always unsettled him. She glanced at him now, huddled in his alcove, and saw the look on his face. It wasn't the blank, weary expression of a janitor waiting for the mess to be over. It was the focused, terrifyingly intense look of a predator watching its prey. She paused for a beat, her brow furrowed, before continuing on her way. If you believe that people deserve to be seen for who they truly are, not just what their job title says, subscribe now and share this story. Now, back to what happens next. Eli closed his eyes, forcing the memory away, but it was replaced by another, sharper and more terrible. The first memory was of institutional failure. The second was of personal hell. 4 years ago. Not the ER, but the oncology ward. The same fluorescent lights, the same antiseptic smell, but now mixed with the cloying sweetness of decay. Anna was no longer the vibrant cellist. She was a fragile, wasted figure lost in a sea of white hospital sheets. The stubborn stomach bug had finally been given a name, 11 months after that first ER visit. A neuroendocrine tumor of the pancreas. A 1 in a million diagnosis, a creeping thief that did its work in stealth until it was too late. By the time they found it, it had metastasized to her liver. Inoperable, terminal. He, Dr. Elias Vance, the surgeon who could pluck bullets from a beating heart, who could reassemble a shattered pelvis like a jigsaw puzzle, could do nothing. He had sat by her bedside for weeks, reading every journal article, calling in every favor, consulting with the world's leading specialists. He argued with her oncologists about experimental treatments, his desperation making him sound shrill, unhinged. They saw him not as a colleague, but as a grieving husband in denial. They were right, of course. The final memory was the worst. The last night. Lily, only 6 years old, had fallen asleep in the armchair, a small, warm ball of innocence in a room saturated with death. Anna was lucid, her breath a shallow whisper. She wasn't talking about her own fear. She was talking about his. "You have to let go, Eli," she had whispered, her fingers cool against his. "Not of me. Of this. This need to fix everything. You can't fix this." Her eyes, huge in her gaunt face, found his. "Just be a dad. That's all Lily needs. Just be her dad." She died an hour after dawn. He remembered holding her hand, feeling the last, faint flutter of her pulse fade into stillness. He had sat there for a long time, the silence in the room more deafening than any siren. And then it happened. He had reached for a glass of water on the bedside table, and his hand began to shake. It wasn't a tremor of fatigue or caffeine. It was a violent, uncontrollable shudder, a neurological storm that started in his fingertips and radiated up his arm. A psychogenic tremor. His grief, his rage, his profound, soul-crushing helplessness had found a physical voice. His career was over. The hands that had saved hundreds of lives could no longer hold a scalpel. They could barely hold a pen. He left Johns Hopkins a month later. He packed up the house, took Lily, and drove west until the landscape was unrecognizable. He changed his name, just a slight alteration, from Elias to Eli, and let his medical license lapse. He chose St. Jude's because it was small, unassuming, and had a janitorial position open on the night shift. It was the perfect place to disappear. The rhythmic, mindless work soothed the tremor. The anonymity protected him. For 3 years, he had been a ghost, a promise keeper, just a dad. A sudden, sharp cry from trauma yanked him back to the present. "Her pressure's cratering. She's throwing multifocal PVCs. Get the crash cart in here," Jennings shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Eli's eyes snapped open. The past receded. The present asserted itself with brutal force. Maya was dying. The propofol wasn't working. Her brain was shutting down. He pushed himself out of the alcove, his feet moving before his mind had fully consented. He was close enough now to see the details on the monitor, to see the frantic, uncoordinated efforts of the team. Thorne was preparing to intubate, his face a grim, set mask. And then Eli saw it. It was a small thing, a detail so minor it was functionally invisible. As a nurse adjusted the blood pressure cuff on Maya's left arm, her gown sleeve rode up, exposing her forearm for a brief second. Under the harsh fluorescent light, Eli saw it, a faint, lacy network of tiny, reddish-purple dots. A petechial rash. It wasn't dramatic, easily mistaken for a heat rash or an allergic reaction. But the pattern, combined with everything else, the nystagmus, the ataxia, the altered mental status, the precipitous crash. It wasn't a seizure disorder. It wasn't encephalitis. It wasn't a drug reaction. The pieces clicked into place in his mind with the cold, hard certainty of a deadbolt locking. He knew what it was. He had seen it twice before in his 18-year career. Both times in patients who were not the typical profile. Both times they were missed by the primary team. He stood at the edge of the curtain, the boundary between his hidden world and the world that had cast him out. He could stay here. He could remain Eli, the janitor. He could let them fail. Let them call a time of death. Let them break the news to the frantic fiancé who was probably pacing in the waiting room right now. He could mop up the floor after they wheeled her body to the morgue. It was his job, after all. But then he saw Anna's face, her eyes pleading with him. Just be a dad. And he thought of Lily, sleeping safely in her bed. What kind of father would she have if he let his fear, his need to hide, allow this to happen? Hiding wasn't protecting her. It was teaching her that the proper response to tragedy was to diminish yourself, to disappear. He had been honoring his grief by building a prison. He had promised Anna he would just be a dad, but a dad protects. A dad does what is right, no matter the cost. He took a breath, the antiseptic air searing his lungs. The decision was made. He let the curtain fall from his hand and stepped out of the shadows. Eli pushed his abandoned mop cart aside with a soft rattle that seemed to echo in the tense corridor. He walked toward the controlled chaos of Trauma 1, his steps measured and deliberate. The janitor's slump was gone, replaced by the erect, purposeful bearing of a man entering his domain. Nurse Helen, rushing past with a tray of vials, saw him approaching the bay, and her eyes widened in alarm. She knew this was a line that was never crossed. She opened her mouth to stop him, but something in his expression, a gravitas she had only ever glimpsed, made her hesitate. He stopped just outside the curtain, his presence a sudden, quiet intrusion. "Dr. Thorne," he said. His voice was calm, not loud, but it cut through the frantic medical jargon like a scalpel. Thorne, wrestling with the laryngoscope, glanced over his shoulder, his eyes flicking down to Eli's gray uniform and then back up to his face with frank irritation. "This is a sterile field and a critical situation," he snapped, his focus already returning to the patient. "Get back to your work, now." Dr. Jennings, ever the sycophant, chimed in with a contemptuous sneer. "Someone get him out of here," he said to no one in particular. Eli didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He held his ground, a fixed point in the swirling panic. "With respect, doctor," he said, his gaze locked on Thorne, "you're missing it. You're treating the wrong thing." This time, Thorne turned fully, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and fury. A janitor was questioning his judgment in the middle of a code. "I have a 22-year-old woman dying on my table, and you are wasting my time," he hissed. "Security!" "Her symptoms," Eli continued, ignoring the threat, his voice dropping into a clinical, didactic tone he hadn't used in 4 years. "The persistent nystagmus, the ataxia, the acute confusion, and now the cardiovascular collapse. Look at her arms." He gestured toward Maya. "She has a petechial rash. You're all missing it." Thorne followed his gaze, annoyed, then squinted. He saw the faint marks. "It's a reaction to the fever, or the stress. It's diagnostically irrelevant." "No," Eli said, the word precise and absolute. "It's classic. It's not a primary seizure disorder. It's Wernicke's encephalopathy." The name dropped into the room like a bomb. There was a split second of stunned silence. Wernicke's encephalopathy, a neurological disorder caused by thiamine deficiency. Jennings actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of derision. "Wernicke's in a healthy young woman?" "Dr. Thorne, that's a diagnosis for chronic alcoholics and the severely malnourished. Her labs are clean. Her liver function is perfect." He turned to Eli. "Maybe you should stick to mopping floors and leave the diagnosing to the people with medical degrees." The insult was designed to sting, to put him back in his place. 4 years ago, it would have sent Elias Vance into a cold rage. But Eli, the janitor, felt nothing but a profound, weary sadness. He had no ego left to bruise. He only had the facts. "You're thinking of the stereotype, not the pathology," Eli said, his voice remaining level, almost gentle. "Severe thiamine deficiency can have non-alcoholic etiologies, hyperemesis gravidarum, bariatric surgery, or any condition causing prolonged vomiting and malabsorption." He took a half-step closer, his eyes finding a stray piece of paper on the rolling tray, a copy of the paramedic's intake form. He pointed a long, steady finger at it. "Right there," her fiancé told the medics. "She had a severe bout of what her GP called the stomach flu 3 weeks ago. She couldn't keep food or water down for almost a month. Her body is depleted of thiamine. You're treating the neurological firestorm, but you're ignoring the fact that the house is out of water. Her brain is literally starving." Thorne stared at him, his expression a roiling mix of anger and a flicker of something else, a dawning, horrified uncertainty. The janitor was not just spouting nonsense. He was constructing a coherent, if unlikely, differential diagnosis. "You have maybe 10 minutes, Eli said, his voice dropping lower, imbued with an authority that was chillingly authentic, "before she suffers irreversible brainstem necrosis. You can run a transkitulase activity assay or check her thiamine levels directly, but you don't have time to wait for the lab. The treatment is the diagnosis. You need to push 500 milligrams of thiamine intravenously. Now." The sheer specificity of the instruction, the exact dosage, the root of administration, was what finally broke through Thorne's wall of professional pride. That wasn't a guess. That was knowledge. That was experience. But Jennings, blinded by hierarchy, stepped between them. "Sir, this is insane. We're about to lose her. We need to follow protocol. We need to intubate and start the propofol drip. We can't base our treatment on a janitor's wild theory." Just then, the main cardiac monitor above Maya's bed let out a long, high-pitched, terrifying tone. A flat line. "She's in a systole," a nurse yelled. "Starting compressions." The room exploded into a new level of frantic, organized action. A nurse climbed onto a stool and began the rhythmic, brutal work of chest compressions. "Push one of epi," Thorne commanded, his face pale, his earlier anger replaced by raw focus. They were losing her. In the sudden, desperate shuffle, a space cleared around Maya's head. Eli saw his opening. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was moving on pure, unadulterated instinct. He bypassed the stunned doctors, his movements fluid and economical, and came to her side. Her eyes were open, but unfocused, the nystagmus gone, replaced by a terrifying stillness. But in their depths, he saw a flicker of something, a spark of consciousness trapped inside a dying machine. He saw pure, unadulterated terror. He leaned in close, his mouth near her ear, shielding her from the chaos of her own resuscitation. He thought of Anna, of her fear, of his inability to offer any real comfort beyond his presence. He couldn't make that mistake again. He whispered 3 words, not a medical command, but a human promise. A benediction. "You are safe." It was what he had wanted to say to Anna, but couldn't, because it hadn't been true. It was what he said to Lily after her nightmares. It was an anchor in the storm. The moment of quiet intimacy, of human connection in the heart of the clinical hurricane, seemed to break a spell. Dr. Thorne, who had been reaching for the epinephrine syringe, froze. He looked from the flat line on the monitor to the janitor whispering in his patient's ear. He saw the absolute, unshakable certainty in Eli's eyes. It was a look he had seen before, in the mirror, back when he was a younger, more confident doctor. It was the look of someone who knew. Protocol, hierarchy, ego. It all evaporated in the face of that terrible flat line. Death was in the room, and Thorne knew, in a gut-wrenching moment of clarity, that everything they were doing was failing. He made a decision. It was career suicide if he was wrong. "Stop compressions!" he yelled. The nurse paused, her hands hovering over Maya's chest. "Everybody, stop!" The room fell silent, save for the horrifying, continuous tone of the monitor. Thorne turned to the medication cart, his movements sharp and decisive. He snatched a vial and a syringe. "Give me the thiamine," he barked at a bewildered nurse. He drew it up himself, 500 milligrams. Jennings stared at him, aghast. "Sir, what are you doing? This is against every protocol." "I'm saving her life, I hope," Thorne shot back, his voice tight with adrenaline. He found Maya's IV line and pushed the plunger home, sending the clear liquid racing into her system. The seconds that followed stretched into an eternity. 6 doctors and nurses stood frozen, their eyes glued to the monitor. The flat line remained. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Jennings shot a look at Thorne that was pure, triumphant. "I told you so." And then a flicker. A single, beautiful, miraculous blip on the screen. A QRS complex. It was followed by another, and another. Sinus tachycardia, but it was a rhythm. The horrifying flatline tone ceased, replaced by the steady, life-affirming beep of a recovering heart. The collective, audible gasp in the room was a sound of disbelief. But the miracle wasn't over. They all watched Maya. The frightening stillness in her eyes began to resolve. The wild, jerking nystagmus that had started the whole ordeal, which had briefly vanished during the crash, did not return. Instead, her eyes, which had been darting in a panicked, unfocused way, began to slow. They blinked. Once, twice. Then they focused. She looked at the ceiling, then at the faces staring down at her, her expression one of profound confusion, but it was a sentient confusion. She was back. She was awake. In the cavernous, ringing silence of Trauma 1, 6 members of the St. Jude's Emergency Department medical team stared, first at the patient, then at the monitors, and finally at the janitor in the worn gray uniform who stood quietly by the bed. He had not saved her with compressions or electricity or powerful drugs. He had saved her with a memory, an observation, and a quiet, certain voice. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of suspended disbelief. The only sound in Trauma 1 was the steady, rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor, a sound that, moments before, had been an impossible dream. Maya was alive. Her breathing was evening out, the frantic edge gone. She was weak, disoriented, but she was present. The storm in her brain had passed. Dr. Thorne stood motionless, the empty thiamine syringe still clutched in his hand like a religious talisman. He stared at Eli, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions: shock, relief, humiliation, and a dawning, profound respect. The rigid certainty he had worn like armor all night had been shattered, and in its place was a raw, unsettling vulnerability. He finally found his voice, but it was a mere whisper, stripped of all its earlier authority. "Who the hell are you?" Eli didn't answer. He didn't need to. His gaze was fixed on Maya, on the gentle rise and fall of her chest. A wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washed over him. It wasn't the triumphant surge of a surgeon after a successful operation. It was something deeper, more personal. It was the quiet, gut-wrenching relief of a man who had finally, after 4 long years, reversed the verdict of fate. He hadn't been able to save Anna, but he had saved this young woman. It was an absolution, but it was a beginning. It was Nurse Helen who broke the spell. She had been standing in the doorway, a silent witness to the entire drama. She stepped forward into the quiet room, her expression one of solemn confirmation. "I ran his name when he first started here," she said, her voice soft but clear, directed at Thorne. "He asked me to keep it to myself. His name is Elias Vance." The name hung in the air, heavy with implication. Dr. Elias Vance. It wasn't a common name. To the medical community, it was legendary. Jennings, who had been leaning against a counter, his face pale, straightened up as if he'd received an electric shock. "Vance? The Elias Vance? From Johns Hopkins?" he stammered. "The Vance procedure for aortic dissection, the one who wrote the book on complex abdominal trauma?" He had a copy of that book, signed, on his shelf at home. He had studied Vance's papers, revered his work. The man he had just told to stick to mopping floors was one of his idols. The color drained completely from his face. Thorne just stared, connecting the dots. The impossible diagnosis, the precise dosage, the unshakable calm under pressure. It all made a terrible, perfect sense. He was standing in the presence of greatness, and he had been treating it like an inconvenience. Before anyone could process the revelation further, a new alarm blared through the ER. A piercing, insistent chime from the main console, followed by the overhead speaker crackling to life. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. Multiple victims, multi-car pileup on the interstate. ETA, 2 minutes. The spell was broken. The ER, which had been frozen in time, lurched back into motion. Adrenaline surged anew. "All right, people, let's move," Thorne yelled. his command voice returning, though it was now tempered with a new, uncertain edge. "Jennings, with me. Helen, get Bay 2 ready." They rushed out, leaving Eli alone in Trauma 1, with a junior nurse who was now checking Maya's vitals, her hands trembling slightly as she worked, acutely aware of who was watching her. The first wave of victims from the pileup arrived in a torrent of noise and agony. The ER was instantly overwhelmed. Eli, feeling exposed and out of place, began to retreat, to fade back into the shadows that had been his home. He picked up his mop, the familiar weight a comforting anchor. But just as he turned to leave, Thorne intercepted him. The on-call surgeon was still 20 minutes out, stuck in traffic caused by the very accident that was now flooding his ER. One of the victims, a man in his 30s, had a severe crush injury to his chest and abdomen. He was hypotensive, his breathing shallow, and the resident in charge was clearly out of his depth. Thorne's face was desperate. He looked at the chaos unfolding in Bay 3, then back at Eli, who was holding a mop like a shield. All pretense was gone. This was not a chief of medicine talking to a janitor. It was one doctor pleading with another. "Dr. Vance," Thorne said, the name feeling both foreign and correct on his tongue. "I need you." Eli froze. The request hung in the air, a bridge back to a world he had sworn off forever. His hands. He thought of his hands, of the tremor that had stolen his life's work. He hadn't felt it for hours, not since the crisis with Maya began. He looked down at them. They were perfectly still. "I can't operate," Eli said, his voice raspy. "I have a tremor." It was the first time he had admitted it aloud to another physician. "I don't need you to operate," Thorne said, his voice urgent, pleading. "I need your eyes. I need your brain. That man is dying, and we are flying blind. Please." This was the second test. The first time could have been a lucky guess, a flash of brilliance from a mind gone to rust. This was different. This was sustained, complex trauma. This was his old world calling him home. He looked at Thorne's desperate eyes, heard the rising panic in the background, and thought of his promise to Anna. Just be a dad. But what if being a dad also meant being this? What if hiding his gifts was its own form of betrayal? He let the mop handle slide through his fingers. It clattered to the floor, the sound lost in the din of the ER. He took a deep breath and walked into Trauma Bay 3, not as Eli the janitor, but as the surgeon he had never truly stopped being. The scene in Trauma Bay 3 was a maelstrom of controlled panic. A young male patient lay on the gurney, his body a canvas of gruesome injuries from the car wreck. His blood pressure was dropping, his oxygen saturation was in the low 80s, and the resident leading the effort, a Dr. Peterson, was barking a series of frantic, contradictory orders. Eli entered the bay, and the chaos seemed to slow down, to sharpen into focus. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push anyone aside. He simply began to speak, his tone calm and instructional. "Dr. Peterson," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. Peterson looked up, startled to see the janitor, but Thorne, standing right behind Eli, gave a sharp, definitive nod. "Report." Peterson, flustered, stammered. 34-year-old male, driver, crush injury to the chest and abdomen. Diminished breath sounds on the left. Abdomen is rigid. We're pushing fluids, but his pressure won't come up. Eli's eyes scanned the patient, then the monitors, his mind processing dozens of data points per second. "The fluids aren't working because he's bleeding out internally, and you're worsening the situation. He has a tension pneumothorax. That's why his pressure is dropping and his O2 is plummeting. The pressure in his chest is compressing his heart and great vessels." "We checked for that," Peterson protested weakly. "Breath sounds are just diminished, not absent." "It's a classic presentation in a high-impact crush injury," Eli countered, his voice patient but firm. "You're waiting for a textbook sign that might not come until he's dead. You need to decompress his chest now." He turned to a nurse. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath." He couldn't perform the procedure himself, not with a scalpel, but this he could guide. He took the large-bore needle from the nurse and handed it to the trembling resident. "Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, right there," he said, pointing to a spot on the patient's chest. He didn't touch the patient, but his hand hovered in the air, a phantom guide. "Insert it just above the third rib. You'll feel a pop." Peterson, his face beaded with sweat, did as he was told. He pushed the needle in. There was a sudden, audible hiss of escaping air. The effect was instantaneous. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had dipped into the 70s, began to climb. 85, 90, 95%. The frantic beeping of the monitor slowed to a more stable rhythm. His blood pressure began to creep back up. The entire team stared in awe. Eli had diagnosed and directed a life-saving intervention in under 30 seconds, without laying a single hand on the patient. "Good," Eli said, his focus already moving on. "Now, his abdomen is rigid. He's bleeding into his belly. The on-call surgeon is still 10 minutes out. You need to buy him time." He began issuing a series of precise, rapid-fire commands for stabilizing the patient, identifying the likely source of the bleed, and preparing him for the OR. By the time the trauma surgeon finally arrived, breathless and apologetic, the patient was stabilized, packaged, and ready. The surgeon took one look at the patient, the readouts, and the orders Eli had initiated, and then looked at Thorne with wide, questioning eyes. Thorne just pointed a thumb toward Eli, who was already quietly wiping his hands on a towel in the corner. The next morning, the sun was streaming through the blinds of Dr. Thorne's spacious office. Eli stood before his desk, feeling deeply uncomfortable. He was back in his gray janitor's uniform, having just finished his shift. The clothing felt like a costume now, a role he no longer knew how to play. Thorne motioned for him to sit. The chair was leather and plush, a world away from the hard plastic of the break room. Thorne himself looked exhausted, but humbled. He pushed a file across his desk. "That's the preliminary report on Maya Collins," he said. "The lab confirmed it. Her thiamine levels were critically, almost undetectably low. You were right. About everything. You saved her from catastrophic brain damage, if not death." He paused, looking Eli straight in the eye. "I've been a doctor for 30 years. I've never been so wrong, and I've never been so grateful to be proven wrong. I apologize. For my arrogance. For my blindness." Eli just nodded, unsure what to say. "I also made some calls," Thorne continued, leaning forward. "I read about your wife, Anna, the misdiagnosis, the NE tumor. I am profoundly sorry, and I think I understand why you left." He took a deep breath. "But St. Jude's needs you, Elias. This hospital needs you. Not as a janitor, as a doctor." Eli felt a familiar coldness grip him. "I told you I can't. My hands—" "I'm not asking you to hold a scalpel," Thorne said quickly. "I spoke to the hospital board this morning. They were intrigued by last night's events. We can create a new position for you, something that doesn't exist. We'll call it Director of Diagnostic Strategy, or Senior Clinical Consultant. You can name your title. You wouldn't have a patient load. You wouldn't be on call in the traditional sense. You would be a teacher, a mentor, a safety net. You'd review complex cases. You'd guide the residents. You'd be the final word when we're stumped. Your only tool would be your mind." He leaned back. "You can name your terms, your hours, your salary, anything." It was a lifeline, a path back to the world he loved, but on his own terms, a way to use his gifts without betraying the vow he'd made to himself on the day his hands had first betrayed him. It was everything he could have possibly wanted, and it terrified him. His first thought was of Lily. The night shift, the anonymity, the low-stakes job. It was all a carefully constructed fortress to protect his time with her, to ensure he was always present, always available. Just Dad. This new role, no matter what Thorne promised, felt like a seduction. It would pull at him. The complex cases, the intellectual challenge, the pull of the world he had mastered. He remembered the years with Anna, the missed dinners, the vacations cut short, the constant distraction of a pager that never slept. He had been a great surgeon, but had he been a great husband? He couldn't bear the thought of becoming that man again, of failing Lily the way he felt he had failed her mother. I need to think about it, Eli managed to say, his voice tight. The tremor, absent all night, threatened to return, a faint vibration in his fingertips born of fear, not grief. He stood up, needing to escape the plush chair, the hopeful eyes of Dr. Thorne, the ghost of his own potential. He needed to go home. Stories like this remind us that expertise can hide anywhere, and dismissing someone based on their position might mean missing the person who could save everything. If that resonates, hit like and comment where you're watching from. Because what Eli does next changes everything. The drive home was a blur. The rain had stopped, and the rising sun was painting the wet streets in shades of pink and gold. It felt like a different planet from the sterile, fluorescent-lit world he had just left. When he walked through his front door, the smell of coffee from Mrs. Gable's percolator greeted him. She was in the kitchen, packing a lunch for Lily, her movements slow and comforting. "Morning, Eli," she said, her smile warm. "Rough night?" "You could say that," he replied, running a hand through his damp hair. He found Lily in the living room, sitting on the floor, surrounded by books about constellations. She was carefully cleaning the lens of her telescope eyepiece with a soft cloth. She didn't look up immediately. That evening, the decision weighed on him so heavily it felt like a physical presence in the room. He was making pancakes for dinner, a Tuesday night tradition. The small kitchen was warm and filled with the comforting smell of batter and melting butter, a stark contrast to the sterile anxiety of the hospital. This was his sanctuary. This was the world he had built to keep the other one at bay. Lily was quieter than usual, pushing a piece of pancake around her plate with her fork. She had her mother's eyes, large, dark, and startlingly perceptive. She looked at him, her head tilted. "Mrs. Gable said something big happened at the hospital last night," she said, her voice small. "She said you helped someone." She paused, her gaze searching his face. "You look different today, Dad. Not sad different. Just bigger." The observation, so simple and yet so astute, cracked open something inside him. He hadn't realized how much he had been shrinking himself, day by day, for the past 4 years. He sat down opposite her at the small kitchen table. The pancakes sat between them, a symbol of the simple, predictable life he was so terrified of losing. He had to tell her the truth. She deserved that. "I did help someone," he began, choosing his words carefully. "There was a very sick young woman, and the doctors were having trouble figuring out why. But I saw something I remembered from a long time ago, and I knew how to help her." He explained the offer from Dr. Thorne, framing it in the simplest terms. "They've asked me to come and help them more often, to be a teacher for the other doctors." He braced himself for the hardest part. But it would be a new job, a day job, and it might mean some days are longer. It might mean I'm not always here the second you get home from school. His voice was tight, laced with the fear of her answer. He was asking for her permission, and he knew it. Lily listened intently, her expression serious. She didn't respond immediately. She picked up her fork and carefully cut a small, perfect square from her pancake. She put it in her mouth and chewed thoughtfully. He waited, his heart pounding. "Mom was a musician," she said finally, her voice matter-of-fact. "She played the cello." She looked at him. She used to say that playing her cello made her feel whole. Like it wasn't just her job, it was her, the music part of her. She put her fork down and locked her eyes on his. The simple wisdom in her gaze was devastating. "Helping people like that," she said. "Is that your cello, Dad?" The question was a key turning a lock he didn't even know was rusted shut. His cello. The thing that wasn't just a job, but an essential part of his being. The part he had amputated out of grief and fear. He had been living as half a man, thinking it was the only way to be a whole father. Tears welled in his eyes, hot and unexpected. He couldn't speak. He just nodded. Lily seemed to understand everything he couldn't say. She reached her small hand across the table and placed it on his. "Would it make you happy?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "Not pretend happy for me. Real happy?" He thought of the look on Maya's face when she woke up. He thought of the hiss of air from the crash victim's chest. He thought of the feeling, not pride, but purpose, that had settled deep in his bones. It was a feeling he thought he'd lost forever. He was so focused on keeping his promise to be present for Lily that he hadn't realized he was presenting her with a hollowed-out version of her father. He was teaching her that loss means you become smaller. He needed to teach her that you can honor the ones you've lost by living as fully as you can. "Yes," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He cleared his throat and met her gaze. "Yes, sweetie, it would." A slow, bright smile spread across her face. "Then you should do it," she said, with the simple, absolute certainty of a child. "Being brave isn't about not being scared. It's doing it anyway. Mom told me that." The next morning, Eli Vance called Dr. Thorne. He accepted the position with two non-negotiable conditions. First, his title would be clinical strategist, nothing with the word doctor in it. He wasn't ready for that yet. Second, his hours were 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. No nights, no weekends, no holidays, unless a true declared mass casualty event occurred. His daughter, he explained, came first. Always. Thorne agreed without a moment's hesitation. "Welcome back, Eli," he said, his voice warm with relief and respect. The following weeks were a period of profound and dizzying transformation. The gray janitor's uniform was folded and put away in the back of a closet. It was replaced by a rotation of simple tweed jackets, soft-collared shirts, and comfortable trousers. He didn't want a white coat. It felt like a costume from a different life. The hospital assigned him a small, unassuming office on the 3rd floor, but he was rarely in it. His place was on the wards. He began to walk the floors, a quiet presence that initially unsettled the staff. They didn't know what to make of him. Was he a spy for the administration? An eccentric consultant? But his purpose quickly became clear. He didn't command. He questioned. He didn't lecture. He taught. He would join the residents on their morning rounds. He'd listen silently as they presented their cases, his eyes taking in every detail of the patient, the monitors, the chart. Then he would ask a single, simple question that would unravel their assumptions. "Why do you think her fever is spiking at the same time every day?" Or, "You focused on her heart, but have you considered that the arrhythmia is a consequence, not a cause? What else could be screaming for your attention?" He started what the residents jokingly called the Vance rounds. They weren't held in a sterile conference room with a PowerPoint presentation. They took place at the patient's bedside. He taught them to look at the patient's hands, to listen to the family's story, to notice the uneaten food on the tray. He taught them that a diagnosis wasn't a data point, it was a story that needed to be read correctly. Dr. Jennings, once so arrogant and dismissive, became his most ardent follower, his notebook perpetually filled with Eli's quiet observations. About a month after he started his new role, a young woman with a bouquet of sunflowers appeared at the nurse's station, asking for him. It was Maya. She was radiant, her cheeks full of color, her eyes bright and clear. Her fiancé stood beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. They found Eli in the hospital cafeteria, sipping a cup of coffee and reviewing a chart. When Maya saw him, her face broke into a wide, tearful smile. She rushed to his table. "I didn't know how to find you," she said, her voice trembling. "They told me you weren't a janitor anymore." She placed the sunflowers on the table, their bright yellow faces a splash of life in the drab room. I had to thank you. My doctors told me what you did, what you figured out." She gestured to her fiancé. "You didn't just save my life, you gave us back our future." Eli felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling that was both unfamiliar and deeply welcome. He looked at this vibrant young woman, at the life stretching out before her. It didn't erase the pain of losing Anna, but it gave the pain a new context. It wasn't a void anymore. It was the foundation upon which this new purpose was built. He simply nodded, unable to articulate the complex wave of emotions. "I'm glad you're well, Maya," he said softly. His presence began to ripple through the hospital's very culture. Thorne, with Eli's guidance, instituted a new hospital-wide directive they called the Diagnostic Safety Net, though everyone else called it the Vance Protocol. Any patient admitted to any floor who was not showing clear improvement or who did not have a confirmed diagnosis within 48 hours automatically triggered a review by Eli. It was a simple, systemic change that forced doctors to confront their uncertainties early. The results were staggering. In the first 6 months, the hospital's rate of major diagnostic errors dropped by 40%. The average patient stay decreased. Morale among the nursing staff, who felt they finally had an advocate who listened, soared. Eli Vance wasn't just fixing patients one at a time. He was healing the institution itself. He was teaching a system how to see. If this story is proving that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about acting anyway, hit subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear this. Because Eli didn't stay invisible. He chose to be seen, and that choice is about to matter more than anyone expected. 2 years passed. The seasons turned, and the new reality settled into a comfortable, life-affirming rhythm. It was a warm evening in early October, the air crisp with the promise of autumn. In the small backyard of their rented house, the scent of grilling burgers mingled with the sweet smell of decaying leaves. Lily, now 12 years old, was at her telescope, her eye pressed to the lens. She was no longer the small, anxious child haunted by nightmares. She was a confident, whip-smart preteen who could debate the merits of colonizing Europa with startling authority. The nightmares had faded away, replaced by dreams of distant galaxies. Dr. Thorne, Eris, as Eli now called him, was there, leaning against the porch railing, a bottle of beer in his hand. He and Eli had become unlikely but close friends, their bond forged in the crucible of that single, transformative night. He was arguing with Lily about the radiation shielding required for a manned mission to Jupiter's icy moon. "The Van Allen belts would fry your electronics before you even got into orbit," Eris was saying, grinning. "Not with a magnetoshell plasma shield," Lily retorted without looking up from her eyepiece. "It's theoretical, but the math works." Eli smiled, flipping a burger on the grill. This was his life now. A life of quiet joys, intellectual debates with his daughter, and the easy comfort of friendship. It was a life he never would have believed possible in the depths of his grief. "Got a call from the CEO at University Hospital today," Eris said, turning to Eli. "They're officially adopting the Vance protocol. That makes 3 other hospital systems in the state." Eli nodded, absorbing the news. His work, the legacy born from his loss, was spreading beyond the walls of St. Jude's. It was taking on a life of its own. His phone buzzed occasionally with texts from Maya, who had married her fiancé and just sent him a picture of their newborn daughter, a beautiful baby girl they had named Anna. He looked over at Lily, who had pulled away from her telescope and was now looking at him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You know, Dad," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "I'm glad you stopped being invisible." The words landed softly, perfectly. He looked at his daughter, her face illuminated by the warm glow of the porch light, and then at his friend, and then at the simple, beautiful life he had managed to build from the wreckage of his old one. He glanced down at his hands. They were steady. The tremor hadn't returned, not even once. It had been a symptom not of grief itself, but of a grief unchanneled, a purpose denied. He realized then that he hadn't made a choice between being Dr. Elias Vance, the brilliant surgeon, and Eli, the present father. He had been asking the wrong question. The goal was never to choose one over the other, but to integrate them, to become whole. Hiding hadn't been a tribute to Anna, living fully was. He wasn't the ghost of Johns Hopkins, haunted by what he had lost. And he wasn't the janitor in the shadows, hiding from what he could be. He was a man who made pancakes on Tuesday nights and debated astrophysics with his daughter. He was a man who taught doctors how to listen. He was a healer, not of bodies on an operating table, but of people, of systems, and finally, of himself. He was Lily's dad, and that, he finally understood, was everything. If this story reminded you that hiding isn't the same as healing, and that being truly seen is worth the risk, subscribe, share, and comment below. Because somewhere right now, someone is hiding gifts the world needs. Maybe this story will remind them to step forward,